Welcome back everyone to the Grand Review Part 2. This video is going to complete the rest of my thoughts on the Grand Campaign and the Battle for Greece DLC as we run through the rest of the Athenian campaign, tackle the Spartan campaign, and then consider what worked and what didn't in this expansion. Obviously, check out Part 1 of this video if you have not seen it yet, as that's where I outline how I go about this review, as well as cover the first half of the scenarios of BFG. Again, be sure to leave a like on the video if you are enjoying the review, comment on what you think of this DLC, and subscribe to the channel for tons more AoE2 content. That's enough of an intro, let's jump right back into the Athenian campaign. You know, it wouldn't really be an Age of Empires campaign if it didn't feature Constantinople, so thankfully that is addressed in the 13th scenario, Wrath of the Regent. Emboldened by their success in Cyprus, the Allied forces look to take the mighty city of Byzantium from the Persians. Nevertheless, the Spartan regent Pausanias is becoming more and more of a jerk, and is no longer trusted by the rest of the allies. With all this in mind, the scenario begins with you simply needing to build up your economy and army to get ready to siege Byzantium. You have a camp to the north, Pausanias has one to the west, and Polycritus and the Greek navy has one on the other side of the Golden Horn. After a while, you will discover that, rather than let the Greeks take their resources and treasures, the Persians would rather sabotage their own storehouses. Unconcerned by this, Pausanias will before long start the siege of Byzantium by himself, and once he breaks through the outer walls, you'll be notified of the Persians sabotaging their own markets and ports. The pro-Athenian contingent will want to make sure that there is actually a city left after they defeat the Persians, so you need to take down the Persian saboteurs before they successfully destroy too many of the markets or ports. Now, you don't necessarily need to fight Pausanias, but he will continuously fight to take the city's Acropolis, and every time he enters a new section of the city, new Persian saboteurs will start to destroy their own buildings that you need to prevent from happening. There's also a nice side quest where you can give a statue of Helios to Pausanias or to the Greek navy. Okay, now this is what I'm talking about with a fun and challenging scenario. There are already plenty of Constantinople-related scenarios in this game already, but Wrath of the Regent features a nice twist with having to take/save the city before your ally. Pausanias begins to attack pretty quickly, so if you don't rapidly build an army yourself, you can lose before you're even ready to attack. The only minor irk I have with this mission is that the Greek navy feels pretty useless since you do really all of the fighting on the land, but it's not that big of a deal. Much more compelling gameplay in this one than in many of the previous Athenian missions. Now, after several years, Greece finds itself relatively at peace. Pausanias was eventually executed by his own people, and the Athenians find themselves the sole head of the alliance, now known as the Delian League. However, Themistocles and Aristides realize that by demanding tribute, Athens is becoming more of a tyrannical empire than a true alliance. Therefore, the 14th mission, the Fruits of Empire, forces you to manage increasingly unruly subjects. So, we find ourselves on almost the exact same map as the final Achaemenid scenario, controlling the same islands that you do in the beginning of that mission. There are still numerous Greek city-states occupying the Aegean archipelago, but at least at the start, they're all allied to you. First, you have to build a wonder to demonstrate your power, and are on a timer to do so. After you complete it, you can choose to exact varying amounts of tribute from your allies. More tribute means that they're more likely to rebel, and vice versa. However, no matter what you pick, Naxos, Charistos, and Andros will all immediately rebel against you. Your task is to destroy the forts of Naxos and Charistos, while you can choose to destroy the forts of the other rebelling islands to win back their loyalty. There is very little gold on the map, so tributes are going to be your main source of that resource. Okay, so I have mixed feelings on the Fruits of Empire. Another interesting mechanic with the whole tribute system, but I still have several small things that annoy me. First, and this is pretty minor, but the initial timer to build the wonder does not specify that you need to have the wonder completed by the end of the countdown, not started by the end of the countdown. The wonder builds more quickly than usual, but you have no way of knowing that going into the level. That aside, it's one thing to revisit a map that you've played in a previous scenario from a different perspective. It's another thing to play the same map with the same starting position, with the same enemies in Naxos and Charistos, with the same objective of destroying their forts. It's a little too similar to the last Persian scenario for my tastes. Still, the lack of gold really makes you reliant on tributes, so I think that part of the scenario is quite well done. Definitely a mixed bag of a mission to me. Our Athenian chapter of the Grand Campaign finally comes to an end in the 15th scenario, Within the Long Walls. In the largest time skip in the whole campaign, this level takes place a full 40 years after Athens cements itself as the head of an empire. Themistocles and Aristides are both gone at this point, and Athens' golden age runs right into the expanding Spartan Empire. The Peloponnesian War is upon us. Enter the latest ruler of Athens, Pericles, who sees his armies getting wrecked by the Spartan warriors and makes the tough decision to bring everyone inside the walls of Athens. Now, Athens still has naval supremacy, so they can bring in resources by sea. The tricky part is getting the public to cooperate cooperate with this plan. And indeed, that is the gameplay of this very unique mission. Pericles must maintain the support of the people for 3 election cycles, maintaining power over your belligerent political rival Cleon with the support of your wise and loving wife Aspasia. Your popularity will decline at an alarmingly quick rate, but there are many ways you can increase it by performing various quests. Some of these are available right away, like sending raids to the Peloponnesus, attacking Spartan camps, and rebuilding the Acropolis. Others you can do periodically, like celebrating a festival, escorting trade ships, and defending Salamis, while still others you can do only once, like sending troops to specific allies and conquering Aegina. You have no way of creating villagers, but you can make fishing and merchant ships, and several of the quests will give you extra resources. Yes, you end up fighting the Spartans in this scenario, but your main enemy is the ever-decreasing popularity counter. Okay, so real talk, this scenario is, in my opinion, absolutely amazing. You defend Athens with democracy and naval power. How much more Athenian can you get? The difficulty level is quite high, especially if you're doing the achievement, but it's still manageable. The quests all feel natural, and the power couple of Pericles and Aspasia versus Cleon creates some excellent dialogue. This is probably my favorite level of the entire DLC, and a truly appropriate end to the Athenian section of the campaign. Phew, our adventures in Athens took us across decades of history in 8 scenarios, with plenty of ups and downs, so for our more broad analysis, just like with the Achaemenids, let's look at the story, characters, plot, and scenario cohesion. As with the Persians, we spend most of our time with a single conflict, the Greco-Persian Wars, with the last scenario leading into the final act of the campaign in the Peloponnesian War. In terms of general historical understanding, at least among most players, this section features some of the most famous battles and figures during this time period. Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, and Pericles' defense of Athens were all important to nail in terms of immersing the player, and I think the campaign largely succeeded in doing that. A lot of this success I would attribute to the narration and animation before each level, as well as the memorable characters and dialogue we see throughout this section of the campaign. Themistocles is obviously the central figure of the second act, and I would say he is one of the most memorable characters in the whole campaign. In a world of proud and arrogant Athenians and Spartans, Themistocles cuts out all the BS with some snide and insightful remarks, which is reflected in the gameplay with all of the cunning maneuvers that you have to do. Alongside that, Aristides and his snobbishness provides an excellent foil to our protagonist, and I have to say that the development of the two characters from rivals to mutual respect to something of friends was really fun to play through. Leonidas and Pausanias certainly fit the aggressive Spartan ideal, and the different paths taken between the Athenians and Spartans became clear throughout the gameplay over time, which was well done. Lastly, Pericles, Aspasia, and Cleon were fantastic one-scenario characters, rounding out this section of the campaign. Of course, that brings us to the level design, and I would say hit or miss would be the best characterization of these scenarios, with more misses than hits. Marathon, Byzantium, and Pericles' defense of Athens were all very strong levels with interesting mechanics and challenges, but every other scenario was just way too easy. Part of this was the fact that you could always get to 200 pop post-imp, but also the OP naval text really diminished the many naval scenarios in our Athenian section of the campaign. So that's this section of Battles for Greece. Some of the most memorable moments in the DLC, as well as some of the most forgettable. Our third and final act of the Grand Campaign, of course, features the Spartans, whose battles against Athens in the Peloponnesian War bring an end to our adventures in Greece. This section is the shortest of the 3 acts, containing only 6 scenarios, which focus on the exploits of the 2 heroes, Brasidas and Lysander. The differences and similarities between these 2 men are the focus of the narrative, with most other characters being only background figures. With that, let's see how the Spartans achieved their most famous victories against Athens. The first Spartan scenario, and the 16th overall, is the appropriately titled I Am Brasidas. With the siege of Athens stalled, the Athenians are raiding the Spartan lands in the Peloponnesus, launching a siege of the city of Methone. To relieve and lead the garrison, Brasidas and his ally Lysander have arrived at the edge of the map, and you have to sneak your way past the siege lines to get to Methone. Once there, the city will be turned over to you, and the wave-based defense begins. Like several scenarios at this point, this is another level that has besiegers, in this case the Athenians, attacking during the day, while at night you can recuperate your forces and sneak into their camps to do some raiding. The Athenian siege lines are impossible to destroy, they have super strong towers that can't be taken down, but there are a few routes to get behind them. There, you need to secure 4 different strategic points, each of which will reduce a type of unit sent at you. You can also visit the local helots to pick up supplies. There's also an aura quest where you have to give a blacksmith some goats. Beyond that, you just have to survive for one more wave once all of the supply depots have been destroyed, at which point you will win the level. Okay, so there's nothing fancy about I Am Brasidas, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. This is a fairly straight up defense mission where you immediately have access to 200 pop post-Imperial Age Spartans. Having to balance defenses with sneaking at night provides engaging gameplay, and the difficulty level is reasonably high. Brasidas is introduced as a gallant hero, whereas Lysander is shown to be ruthless, bloodthirsty, and honestly a little bit creepy. He's great. The Athenian raids only increase in volume in the 17th scenario, Pyres on the coast. Brasidas and Lysander are tasked with defending the local coastal towns of Sparta, as well as the Helot villages nearby. There are 7 towns in total, each with a trade workshop. 5 of these must survive until the end of the level. The Helots, who are basically the Spartan serfs, have villages in the region as well. They will periodically give you tribute, but if you loot their ancestors' tombs or if Athenian agitators show up, they will rebel and force you to beat them back in line. Therefore, the gameplay of this scenario is really about you rushing around with your armies to defend your allies, as the Athenians arrive by ship and you have none of your own. This can be rather tricky, as the Spartan infantry is not particularly known for being fast, and if you are out of position, a village's trade workshop can go down pretty fast. There's also an aura quest where you need to slay some lions. Alright, so Pyres on the coast is certainly an interesting scenario, but the difficulty can vary a lot, at least in my 3 playthroughs of the mission. In my experience, it seems like not raiding the Helot tombs whatsoever is by far the better choice, because the Helot villages will barely rebel, and you'll receive regular tributes from them. If you destroy the Helot offerings meanwhile, then you will face increasing ambushes from the angry Helots, and if you destroy all of them, basically the entire map will become your enemy. As for the Athenian raids, it's mostly a matter of just being in position. There's also a fair bit of waiting around at the end for the final Athenian raid to commence. Not a bad scenario per se, but a little rough around the edges as far as the gameplay goes. The difference between Brasidas using the carrot to entice the Helots to support them, while Lysander is using the stick to scare them into line, is a nice characterization of the two protagonists. At long last, the Spartans are ready to counterattack in the 18th scenario, Speeches and Spears. After learning the Athenian allies to the north are wavering in their loyalty, Brasidas and Lysander lead an army towards Thrace and Macedonia to see if they can't wrest them away from their enemies. You begin the scenario with a large army to the center of the map, and Brasidas shows Lysander that you can secure victory with words as well as with swords by destroying the mills in the nearby city of Athens to gain their support. Then you make your way northwest where you take a large city from the Athenians and the scenario begins in earnest. Basically, there are 5 other cities on the map, and you need to secure an alliance with each of them. This can be done through violence, aka damaging their fort, or through clever diplomacy, aka building a castle in the designated areas outside the cities. To the west of the map, there is also the camp of Perdiccas, the king of Macedonia, who offers you his support for 1,000 gold. You can get him to help you if you wish, but no matter what you do, Perdiccas will betray you eventually. Once the region is yours, you have to face none other than Cleon in one big final battle, which you win, but leave Brasidas mortally wounded in the process. Okay, so honestly, this scenario feels a bit off to me. There are a few factors here, but the most obvious of which is the fact that you don't ever really use diplomacy, even though that's what the level is centered around. Destroying mills and building fortification next to hostile cities feels an awful lot like intimidation rather than eloquent speeches, especially if you're cutting through the army of that city to make it happen. It makes the entire unique aspect of this mission fall flat, as indeed this just feels like another 200 pop, post-imp, freely boom, and patrol across the map type of scenario. A decade later, Lysander now leads the Spartan forces and must relieve the Athenian siege of Syracuse all the way in Sicily in the 19th scenario, To the Wall! As Lysander arrives, the Athenians are attempting to build a wall around Syracuse, and the Syracusans, led by the rather jovial, portly, money-interested Gylippus, are attempting to intercept that wall with their own counter-wall. Very much a, yo dog, I heard you like walls situation. Regardless, relying on just trade and fishing, from a military base within Syracuse's walls, you have to simultaneously defend the Syracusan builders while staving off the Athenian ones. This can be a bit tricky if you aren't prepared, as the Athenians will constantly attack you. However, once you get your wall completed, you will gain a few villagers, and the build and destroy portion of the level begins. To win, you must destroy the 4 Athenian forts to break the siege of Syracuse. 2 of these forts are located in the massive, heavily walled siege camp to the west, and the other 2 are on a well-fortified island to the south. You can weaken the Athenian army by destroying supply storehouses on the Athenian Navy's island, and you can weaken the Athenian Navy by destroying the lumber camps to the west of the Athenian army's base. There is also the Olympia to the far west of the map, and securing it will give your troops a huge HP boost. Okay, so of all of the scenarios in the Grand Campaign, To the Walls feels the most like a Chinese custom campaign. I absolutely love the first section of the scenario, it's creative and challenging, and the dialogue between Gylippus and Lysander is golden. Poor Gylippus just wants to be Lysander's friend, and our protagonist ain't having none of that. On the other hand, the gameplay in the build and destroy section is really grindy. Like a Chinese custom campaign, you have a full 200 pop post-imp, a massive amount of resources with the added potential for trade, and you have to slowly grind your way through the infinite unit spam of the Athenians. I will say that having played this mission twice, going around the Athenian base to destroy the lumber camps and secure the temples makes the scenario go much much faster than focusing on the water first. But yeah, overall, a scenario that starts better than it finishes, in my opinion. Realizing the need of a navy to defeat Athens, Lysander makes the trek to Ionia to do some fundraising in the 20th scenario, Blood and Gold. Starting from the town of Ephesus, Lysander must plunder his way across the map to secure the gold needed to build his fleet. None other than Cyrus, king of Persia, is supporting the Spartans on this expedition, brought together by their shared enemy of Athens. In this hectic and huge scenario, you have around 65 in-game minutes to build a fleet. However, you cannot build it yourself. You have to tribute gold to Ephesus so they can build it. To secure gold, you need to raid your way across Ionia, conquering numerous towns and cities to gain resources. You need to split the resources that you capture between getting more troops and upgrades, while also making sure that you're sending enough gold to Ephesus to build up your navy. There are also several quests and side objectives you can do for the Persians, which will yield you both a ton of extra gold as well as bonuses to your ships. Once the timer has elapsed, you lose control of everything except your shiny new navy, and you have to defeat the Athenian fleet to win the scenario. Alright, so I actually love this scenario. The brutal raids fit with Lysander's bloodthirsty personality, and it's a great way to set up the final showdown against Athens. It also brings back the Persians, who have otherwise not had much of a role for a long time. Even Miletus, former home of Aristogoras, makes a return appearance to bring the campaign full circle. Gameplay-wise, the mission feels unique with you having to balance between building an army and building your fleet, and the timer definitely puts you on the hot seat. It's often better to split your forces to take different locations at once because there is a lot to explore on the map. Honestly, I'd say that this is one of the strongest scenarios in the whole Grand Campaign. And now, finally, last but not least, we have our 21st and final scenario of the Grand Campaign, the Fall of Athens. The stage is set. Athens is reeling from their losses in Sicily, and even their naval power has been challenged by Lysander. All that remains is for Sparta to take the city itself and end the Peloponnesian War once and for all. This map will look very familiar, as it's basically the same one from within the Long Walls, except from the perspective of Sparta. A very straightforward mission. You start with control of a large base to the far west of the map, and you have to fight your way across Attica until you reach Athens. There, you can win by either holding the Acropolis or 3 storehouses within the city. However, between here and there, you have to contend with Athens' remaining allies. Salamis, Aegina, Eleusis, Oenoe, and Plataea all send forces to attack you regularly. However, individually they are not all that powerful, so you can simply break them one by one on land and sea. Once you take Eleusis, King Agis of Sparta will send reinforcements, which can vaguely help. As a reward for taking each city, you can also choose a special technology to research at the Wonder to make your units even more OP. Lastly, the Athenian navy is attempting to rebuild while you are building up on land, so you need to keep their naval numbers below 80. Other than that, head on, apply directly to the forehead with your Spartan warriors. Okay, so the grand finale of Battles for Greece is certainly appropriate in scope, a huge battle between Athens and Sparta. The gameplay is overall pretty solid, but I do have a few small critiques. Most notably, the Athenian allies all feel pretty underwhelming, and it doesn't take much to snipe the specific buildings that are pointed out to you to crush them. It then leads to the extra infantry techs you can get at the Wonder, which all feel a little excessive considering your infantry is already OP with pole marks and Lysander's aura. I mean, yes, you could have chosen cavalry auras or archer auras with the Spartans, but let's be real here. The Athenians put up a stout defense at the end, but the difficulty curve feels a bit off. Also, King Agis feels completely random, thrown into the level, and doesn't really seem to serve that much of a purpose. Alrighty, one more section of the campaign to review, and then I'm going to be giving some closing thoughts and takeaways from the Grand Campaign as a whole. Before that though, the Spartan section. Although this is the shortest leg of the Grand Campaign, all 6 missions are pretty long and involved, so you don't feel shortchanged. As usual, the characters are fantastic. Brasidas is the Spartan version of All Might, Mr. Gallant and Honorable, whereas Lysander is vindictive and brutal. It's a great combo to have them fight side by side, and then eventually Brasidas passing the torch to Lysander to close out the war. As for the Peloponnesian War, it's another nice progression, with the Spartans on the back foot trying to defend Methone from raiders, to eventually ridding the Peloponnese of the Athenians. Only then can you lead a counterattack to weaken Athens in the north, and then turn the tide in your direct battles at Syracuse. Then you can look to build a navy to rival the Athenians with the help of the Persians, all leading to one final showdown. Each scenario leads clearly into the next, and they nicely bring this entire campaign to a satisfying conclusion. The only gripe I have with the story is that you're never really given a good reason as to why the Spartans are fighting the war in the first place, especially as it's stated multiple times in the campaign that the Spartans rarely leave their homeland. As for the gameplay, there are definitely some more hits and misses, but I consider the Spartan section to probably be the strongest in delivering challenging missions, which I really appreciate. I do think there is too much use of 200 population post-Imperial Age scenarios, which is all of them in this section, as it doesn't really give you a chance to lean into the Spartan eco bonus or early game armies, but we can talk more about that later. For a last word on Sparta, you certainly get an opportunity to use the supercharged Spartan infantry units, although I still feel like the Civ goes a little overboard with the aura buffs. And yet it's still fun to lead your mighty red cloaks to victory. Okay, now that we've covered every section of the campaign, we're gonna finish our review with some broader thoughts I have on the entire experience, as well as aspects of BFG that I enjoyed or didn't throughout. But before anything else, I just want to reinforce that I believe this DLC was a great first attempt from Capture Age, and it did a lot well, and the stuff that I think needs to be improved can be implemented. That said, let's look at what Battles for Greece brings to the table that other DLCs have not yet done. First, a continuous story. This is the single longest AoE2 campaign experience, and by a significant margin. Having a narrative transition perspectives throughout history was tested with Dawn of the Dukes, with the Lithuanian campaign leading into the Poles campaign leading into the Bohemians campaign. That was really well received back then, giving more time for players to interact with all of the different historical figures. That proves to be the case in Battles for Greece as well. With the focus on such a distinct time frame with this DLC, BFG really leaned into the long-standing wars between the powers of the Eastern Mediterranean. I would call this successful. Second, animated intro slides. Since Age of Kings, scenarios have always featured a single narrator for a campaign with pen and ink sketches with only ambient music playing in the background. BFG still has a single narrator, but the animated slides in the style of ancient pottery, as well as the dramatic music, certainly lean into the epic feeling of many of the battles. Again, very well done. Third, choices. This expansion is the very first one to give player choices that can impact future scenarios. I love this idea in theory, but the execution here fell a bit flat. It was never really clear what exactly would impact future scenarios, and when you were told that you did something in a previous level, the quote reward would typically feel negligible. Nothing really changes as far as the core gameplay or objectives, at least as far as I can tell. However, the fact that they even tried this is really cool, and I think there is a foundation here for more interesting and complex choices in later expansions. Fourth, aura effects. Obviously related to choices, but throughout Battles for Greece, you can perform side objectives to grant your main hero various aura effects, buffing your infantry, cavalry, or archers. This was another idea that sounds really cool, but in practice made many scenarios feel too easy. Especially since the new civs tend to have aura boosts anyway, your units throughout the campaign become insanely strong, especially once you have several auras stacked on top of each other. It could be fun for a power trip romp, but not exactly what I would call compelling gameplay. Maybe making aura effects conditional to a certain strategy, or if there was a trade-off, we could see these aura effects feel a bit more interesting than passively making your units OP. Fifth and last, UI design. This is pretty minor, but the UI of BFG had some notable changes from the traditional AoE2 campaigns. Having the scenarios in a single row, but with the background of a visual on a map that jumps around depending on the location, is clearly inspired from AOM. Not bad, but I think it's a little lame that before you even start playing, you can see exactly how long the campaign is, as well as where the obvious sections begin and end. Relatedly, seeing the map overview before each scenario, breaking down the factions and even side objectives feels a little lame. The player should have to explore and figure that stuff out themselves. You can always use hints and the scouts report to point players in the right direction. Now, with the new stuff out of the way, let's consider our bread and butter of all AoE2 campaigns, the story and the gameplay. If you've been paying attention, my thoughts on these points should already be pretty clear. Starting positively, the narrative in this campaign is the best and most memorable since Age of Conquerors. The progression between the wars feels natural without enormous events happening off-screen, and the characters, voice acting, and dialogue are about as good as you can get. I don't really have much to say on this topic other than the story and characters are going to be what sticks in the minds of many players, especially casual ones, and BFG really sets the standard for future Capture Age DLCs. Seriously, well done. On the flip side, the scenario design and progression felt all over the place. Most scenarios felt huge in scale, featuring gigantic armies in the Imperial Age, even when what was being depicted were just skirmishes or small-scale battles. Especially as you were covering the rise and fall of empires, the gameplay should reflect that in going from low population, low-tech, smaller missions to big epic fights. They have the big battles, but it's like having a song that is only loud the entire time, not featuring any peaks or valleys. As I kept on saying, the missions themselves certainly felt hit or miss. You had many missions like Chasing Smoke, Raise the Sails, Divine Salamis, Across the Wine Dark Sea, and the Fall of Athens that felt way too easy, even on hard difficulty. In my opinion, some of this has to do with stacking aura effects, and some of this has to do with certain levels just needing more iterating. It's okay to make a campaign that appeals to casual players, but there should always be an option for more challenging settings for the more hardcore players, like obviously myself. Not everyone needs to be entitled to beat every mission on hard. It's okay to make challenges. Similarly, level levels like Fire and Water, Within the Long Walls, and I Am Brasidas really are challenging, so it feels a bit inconsistent in that way. I would rather have a difficulty setting that makes every level feel like the more challenging missions, while having the easier scenarios be how most of the levels play out on the lower settings. So that's my review of Chronicles Battle for Greece, the Grand Campaign. This is pretty uncharted territory for an AoE2 expansion, and I appreciate the devs keeping it separate from multiplayer gameplay. It allows the civilizations to be as imaginative as possible without interfering with ranked multiplayer or pro tournaments. Capture Age clearly put a ton of time and effort into this expansion, and even if I believe certain elements were not quite that successful, I'm nevertheless impressed with the foundation that this DLC lays for future expansions. Having a good story is a key to keep players engaged, and I have a lot more faith in the devs refining their scenario design over time than if the gameplay was good but the stories were uninspired. But that's going to be it for this video. It looks like there's going to be another Chronicles DLC in the future that will cover Philip of Macedon and Alexander the Great, so I'll be really interested to see how that one goes. Lastly, I do want to thank my Patreon subscribers who helped me make content like this, with Dan and Jared in the Great Wolf tier, and Carolyn, Dieter, Liquid Egg Product, Ryru, and Tanduri in the Dire Wolf tier. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.